morning, y'all. Nice to be able to see everybody. Nice to be able to just have the conversation about the faithfulness and the goodness of God. I have to tell you, it's been interesting just for me personally, just in traveling around the state and when talking to people and the tasks that God has placed on me at this point to be able to do. For all those things, as I travel around, I'm always listening for what's the emotion, what's the word, what are people talking about at this point. Cindy and I were talking about this not long ago, and I said, I think people have shifted now, just as they're having conversation, from I'm angry to I'm afraid. And I hear that more and more from people, not just about the country, but about their family, about what's going on, that people are more and more and more living just afraid. And I understand the emotion of it. There is this little war in the Middle East. There is a China that's on the move. There is an economy that's struggling. There are all kinds of conversations nationally and domestically. There are all kinds of issues that are happening with national debt and all kinds of things. And now you're depressed, welcome to church. But I get all that. But for the people of God especially, are we designed to live in fear and to say, I'm afraid all the time? Or is the situation in the world, and the situation in our nation, and the situation in our state, moments actually to be able to help others know the faithfulness and presence of a God who is and who cares? In a strange way, to be able to watch the challenges that we face used for the glory of God in the lives of individual people. I think it's worth at least exploring, don't you think? So there was a study that was done not long ago. It's actually a university that they over and over again, they asked the same question, what are people afraid of? So you want to know the list from 2023? Too bad you're going to hear it anyway. Okay, so Chapman University, they're in California, you'll be able to tell. Chapman University, they list the survey of American fears. Here are the things that Americans are afraid of. Number one, they're afraid of corrupt government officials. I have no idea what they're talking about. Number two, the economic and financial collapse, okay? Number three, Russia using a nuclear weapon. Number four, the U.S. becoming involved in another world war. Number five, people I love becoming seriously ill. Number six, people I love dying. Number seven, pollution of drinking water. Mine's fine, by the way. Number eight, biological warfare. I actually haven't been in a lot of conversation with people about biological warfare. Maybe they talk about this more in California than we do. Cyber terrorism was number 9. Number 10 was having enough money for the future. You can tell this study wasn't done in Oklahoma because our list would cap out with things like ticks with Lyme disease, copperhead snakes, really big spiders. We would have a different list of things that we're actually going through to be able to be on top fears for us. But it's interesting to me that this is a constant thing for people to be able to say, are we living afraid? And if so, what do we do about that? So I want to walk back through a passage that maybe you don't spend a lot of time in. Maybe your Bible doesn't flop open immediately to Deuteronomy 31, but go look at it. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it's there in the front. 5th book, Deuteronomy 31. And we're going to spend a little time at the end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Joshua. And let me set the context for you. Moses is 120 years old. In fact, he's going to remind everybody of that in just a minute. He's an old man, and he knows he's about to die. He knows he's not going to enter the promised land. There's a long conversation on that. We'll have a different day maybe. He knows he's not going to enter the promised land, but he's been leading and teaching people now for 40 years as they've been wandering through the desert. And he wants to do some final words to them. And he's got final words, and he's got final challenges to them, and he's got a final blessing for them, and all those things that he does. But he knows this is the end for him. And we're going to talk a little bit about that ending point where it all shifts as well in the entire country based on what's happening in Moses. But it's interesting, Moses comes to them, and this is Deuteronomy 31, beginning in verse 1. It says, so Moses continued to speak these words to all Israel, and he said to them, I'm 120 years old today. And I don't know if he meant like today I am, or if it's like, hey, it's my birthday. I don't know. But I'm 120 years old today. I'm no longer able to go out and come in. The Lord has said to me, you shall not go over this Jordan. The Lord your God himself will go over before you. He will destroy these nations before you so that you shall dispossess them, and Joshua will go over as your head. Joshua, by the way, who was the right hand to Moses for 40 years. He was his aide, as the term is called, but he's the right hand to Moses for all this time. He says, okay, everything's about to transition to Joshua. And it says, and the Lord will do to them, the nations there, as he did to Shihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and to their land when he destroyed them. And the Lord will give them over to you, and you shall do to them according to the whole commandment that I've commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them. For it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Then Moses summoned Joshua, and he said to them in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it, for it is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. So just to kind of take it, Moses is standing in front of all the people and saying to them, I'm not going to go with you, but God is going with you. Be strong and courageous. Then he grabs Joshua and he pulls him up in front of everybody and says, Joshua, he's going to lead you. And he turns to Joshua and he says, Joshua, be strong and courageous. Now, then all the people leave and Moses and Joshua go to what's called the tent of meeting, and they're gathering there to be able to meet with God. And at the end of that verse, there still Deuteronomy 31, verse 23, it says, and the Lord commissioned Joshua, son of Nun, and said to him, be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the people of Israel into the land that I swore to give them. I will be with you. It's a really interesting little connection there. Moses speaks to the people and says, be strong and courageous. He turns to Joshua and says, you be strong and courageous. And then Moses and Joshua go to be able to meet with God and to be able to spend time in prayer. And at this moment, God speaks to Joshua, not to Moses, and says, be strong and courageous. Then what happens is really interesting. I don't know if you know this section of Deuteronomy 31. Moses then turns and blesses the tribes one by one. And then God calls Moses and says, I want you to go up on this particular mountain, and I want you to go up and I'm going to meet with you there. And Moses goes up alone. Kind of think about Sinai here. If you know scripture, like the 10 Commandments, where Moses went up alone to be able to get the 10 Commandments from God, and God meets with him there. He's up there so long that the people say, oh, the old guy died up there. He's not coming back. And so that's when they created the Baal, and they started all this crazy stuff down in the camp, and then Moses shows up again. Remember all that? Well, this time God says to Moses, come on up on the mountain. And they head up Moses heads up by himself on the mountain, and there at the top of the mountain he meets with God. And there at that mountain, Moses dies alone, just he and God. And Deuteronomy says God himself buried Moses in a place no one even knows. So literally Moses just goes up on the mountain by himself, and he's up there for a while and doesn't come back. Here's the death announcement of Moses. You ready? Flip over to your right, Joshua chapter 1. I know, isn't this an exciting passage so far? You're like, man, I'm glad I came to church today. We're talking about fear and death, okay? Joshua chapter 1. It says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. No one knew it at that point. God comes to Joshua and he says, he's not coming back. Moses is gone. Then God says to Joshua, now therefore arise. Go over this Jordan, you and all the people, into the land that I'm giving them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I've given to you, just as I promised Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon to as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, to the land of the Hittites, the great sea, towards going down to the sun, all of it will be your territory. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commands you. Don't turn from it to the right or the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do all that's written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and you'll have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. 7 times in this passage, either Moses or God himself turns to Joshua and says, be strong and courageous. Why do you tell somebody 7 times to be strong and courageous? Because they're afraid. I mean, it's not hard to be able to figure out. There's 2 things that are here. When you get really scared, people are going to come to you and to encourage you. This is not like you're heading into Disneyland, okay? So be strong and courageous. Unless you're the dad hauling all the stuff, thinking about getting on the It's a Small World ride, then be strong and courageous, okay? Because I don't know how many of you dads have been on the It's a Small World ride. Be strong, okay? I'm just telling you right now. It's not like that moment. This is not like you're standing outside of Brahms. No one stands outside of Brahms and says, you're going to get ice cream? Be strong and courageous, okay? That's not how it really works. You say this 7 times for 2 reasons. One is, this is about to get hard. 2 is, you're afraid. So when it's about to get hard, and you know it, and you pause for a minute, God whispers into your soul, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Therefore, be strong and courageous. There's something to this that I think just all of us need to be able to come back to and to be just reminded of. That God has been faithful, and he's not going to stop being faithful. Let me just walk through. There's a lot we could go through in this passage. We're not going to have time for all of it. But let me just pull a few threads out of this. Can I do that? And just to say, let's talk about a couple of these. The first thing is this, that I see from this. Courage is easier when you remember that the Lord will be with you. Courage is easier. It's like walking through a certain difficult area of, just imagine it, whatever town that you're traveling in that you're unfamiliar with, and it gets scary, and you're walking through town and you're a little bit nervous. You get nervous about that because you think, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know who's around there. I don't know what's going on in this area. But it would be different if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is actually walking with you. You with me on that? I'd be slightly less afraid. Or maybe if his bodyguard, The Rock's bodyguard, is Chuck Norris, okay? So if Dwayne "The Rock" is walking and his bodyguard is with him, that's Chuck Norris, and they're walking alongside of you, and you're walking through town, you're not quite as intimidated. Are you with me? Because they're with you. It's that moment that we forget at times when life gets really hard and things get really complicated, that we sometimes forget, oh, that's right, God is walking with me. Why should I be afraid? It was my favorite question that my girls ever asked me when we were at a cross-country meet that they were running in, that they were preparing for, was when they would look at me and they would say, Dad, are you going to be there? It wasn't that I was going to run alongside them. By the way, they're way faster than I am, so that I would slow them down horribly. It wasn't that I was going to run alongside them, it's that I was going to be there. We forget that at times with God. At some moments when things get difficult and things look scary on the horizon, we just forget the simple truth when he said, I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you. I'm going to be there. I think sometimes we get afraid of whatever is coming in life, of financial decisions, of jobs, of what we're going to do next, of who we're going to date and what we're going to do, and all those kind of decisions. I think we get fearful at times when we think, I don't really know if I'm in God's will. It's at that moment you really do get a little bit scared. Because I have to tell you, when things get difficult and you know you're still in the center of God's will, it's different than when things get difficult and you think, I knew this was a wrong decision from the beginning. Those are 2 different emotions. Years ago when Cindy and I, when we've been in youth ministry for 22 years, and God completely interrupted our life and called us to run for Congress, we spent about 7 months struggling with that and praying that through. That was not an easy decision for us, but God just kept affirming, this is what follow me looks like. This is what follow me looks like. And so when I resigned and stepped out and we started the run, I had lots of folks that were longtime friends that caught me and said, you've left the ministry. Why would you leave the ministry? And that statement kind of stung me for a while, and I had to process that. But I came back to all of them and said, listen, here's what I'm most concerned about. I'm not most concerned about what job I'm in. I'm most concerned about who I follow and being with him. That's what I'm most concerned about. To the best of my ability of what I'm sensing from God's leadership, this is what he's calling me to do. And the worst place for me to be is outside of God's will. But if I'm inside of his will, I'm literally living in the shadow of his wings. And when the storm comes, that's the best place to be, is with him. Because the storms will come in life. They will always be there. But it is different when you're walking in the center of God's will. So as crazy as it sounds, are you living afraid of a life decision because you're afraid God won't be there, or you're afraid that you've walked away from God's will and you're in a spot he doesn't want you to be in? Proverbs says twice, actually. It's interesting. There are very, very few things in Proverbs that actually has two different times it says the same thing. But Proverbs in two different places says there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. There's a way that feels like it's a good thing to do, but in reality, it's not in God's will. Sometimes when we're afraid, we've forgotten that God is with us, but sometimes when we're afraid, we find ourselves afraid because we realize I've walked away from what God's best is. Could be the debt that you're facing, could be a job decision or a house decision or any number of a million things in life. But if you're living in the center of God's will, even when the storm comes, that's the right place to be. So first things first, simple statement, courage is easier when you remember that the Lord is with you. Second statement, courage is a lot easier when you remember God's faithfulness. When you remember God is faithful. Did you pick up in Deuteronomy 31 when Moses said to them, remember Shihon and Og? Did all of you go, oh yeah, Shihon and Og? Yeah, I forgot. Did anyone know who Shihon and Og is? It's really funny to me when I hear Moses say that, when he says, remember Shihon and Og, and we just read right past it. Like, okay, whatever, whoever those guys are. I mean, Og sounds like a caveman kind of thing, like Shihon, who in the world? What's interesting is Shihon and Og, and I'm going to do a quick history lesson, so don't fade on me, okay? When they came in towards the promised land, they've been wandering around in the desert for 38 years at this point. And they come up to the edge. They're on the east side of the Jordan overlooking the promised land area. When they come in that area, God says to them, hey, pass through this area, pass through this area, pass through this area. And then they get to Shihon in that area. He's a king, by the way, a leader. Og is also a different king of a different set of tribes. When they get to that one, God says, oh no, you're going to fight this one. You're not going to just pass through, you're going to fight. For 38 years, they've been wandering around, living in tents, eating manna, getting water out of a rock. I mean, the best people ever taken care of. And now suddenly God says, oh no, now the battle's on. Now you're going into the next area, you're going to actually have to fight. They haven't had a fight in 38 years. The whole generation hasn't. And it steps up and it says, Shihon comes to the battle line with a great army. And they meet in the field. And no one knows what's about to happen. But Israel, in its first big battle, just east of the Jordan, wins. And then Og, the leader of Bashan, he comes out to the battle line, and Israel wins that battle as well. It's the first two battles, really the first one, they were up there side by side. It was the first big battle that they faced as a generation. and they won them, and they watched God's faithfulness. And Moses comes back to them and he says, do you remember the battles with Sihon and Og, how worried you were? How you were afraid as you walked into the battle line, and how faithful God was? Do you remember? That generation would have all nodded their head and said, oh yeah, we remember. And Moses said, then don't forget that God was faithful that day. Here's what's really interesting. 35 times in the Old Testament, many of them in the Psalms, Sihon and Og are referenced again. 35 times. The Hebrews continue to be able to bring up over and over again Sihon and Og. They never forgot that first battle on the east side of the Jordan. They never forgot it. So here's my crazy question for you. Who is your Sihon and Og? Where, what? When was the first time you watched God be faithful in your life? What happened? Now, for some of you that came to Christ just in the past year, it may be a really recent memory, but for some of you, it could have been years ago when you first came to Christ. When was the first time you watched God do something only God could do? Do you remember that moment? Do you go back to that moment and to say, God, I remember when you were faithful then? Or has life become so complicated and hard that that battle looks simple now and you don't go back to it anymore? Moses just said to them, hey, don't forget about the first battle. Because God was faithful in the first battle, that prepared you for the next one, which will prepare you for the next one, which will prepare you for the next one. If you'll sit and visit with a godly believer who's walked with God and is in their 90s, ask them about the battles that they faced and ask them if they got easier or harder. They'll probably smile at you and say they all got harder. But I watched God early. He was faithful then. He was faithful then. He was faithful then. We become more courageous when we remember that God has been faithful. And he's not going to stop being faithful now. Who is your Sihon? When was that moment you first watched God be faithful? And do you remember that he's still going to be faithful in the next battle as well? Third thing, courage has to come when you quit thinking it's about someone else. Courage has to come when you quit thinking it is about someone else. And this is a little more complicated, but I want to dig into this one a little bit. Because it's different for Joshua now in Joshua chapter 1 than it was for Joshua in Deuteronomy 31. In Deuteronomy 31, Moses is there. Joshua 1 begins with God saying to him, Joshua, Moses is dead. Now it's on you. So be strong and courageous. Realize this, Joshua was 60 years old at this point. He's 60. We think about this, he was really beginning his public actions at 60 years old. For the last 40 years, he's been the assistant to Moses. He's been the guy hauling around Moses' stuff. He's been the one that's been there trying to be able to help him all the time. But now Moses is gone. Now at 60, it's time for him to be able to step up and to be able to lead in a brand new way. And God says to him, be strong, be courageous, because it's not about somebody else, it's about you now stepping up into this. I find many people that God places them in an assignment, in a task, or brings something to them that immediately they think somebody ought to do that. Somebody else, not me, ought to do that. And God whispers into your soul, no, that's you. Somebody else used to do that, but now it's you that needs to do that. You are the one who is to be strong and courageous. Now that's at the moment that all of us go, I'm not ready, I'm not prepared, I don't have enough, I don't do enough, no one recognizes me as the leader. We start going through all the different excuses. You with me? And the whole time God is whispering into your soul, it's you this time. You're the one I'm calling to be able to take this on. Now be strong and courageous. The nice thing is that God is so compassionate on Joshua, he comes back to him 7 times and says, be strong and courageous. I'm gonna be with you. I'm gonna be there. I'm gonna be there. So take this up, because now it's your turn to be able to lead in that area. I don't know what it is that God is calling you to do, but I see an awful lot of needs in our nation. A lot. Those needs are not going to be met by somebody else somewhere else. They're right here. They'll be met by you. When God whispers into your soul, that's your assignment. I know somebody else used to do that. Now it's you. You're the one who has it now. That's at the moment we all have a big gulp and say, okay, God, I want you to be there. And he says, be very strong and courageous. I'll be there. Friday, I spent the day in the wonderful city of Altus. I have to tell you, you're not supposed to have favorites as you travel around 77 counties, but one of my favorites is Altus. Altus is just a really neat town with some really great folks that are there. And as I travel on all kinds of places and I get to Altus, it's like going into a family reunion every time I go to Altus. Because people are just so incredibly friendly. Maybe it's because they get a quarter-inch of rain every 10 years. And they just know they've got different kind of needs and different kind of relationships. But it's a really neat community. But one of the secret sauce for Altus is that Altus intentionally trains the next leaders on everything. They're always mentoring. There's a whole group of farmers that have younger farmers that they're very intentionally getting a chance to be able to mentor and to be able to train. The city leaders are that way. The liaison between the Air Force Base and the city folks, that's a generational thing that they're always looking for who the next generation is. In fact, you may or may not know it, but in the United States Air Force has an award for communities and their engagement with the local base. And every community across the country that has an Air Force base competes for this award. The award's name is the Altus Award. That's literally the name of the award, named after Altus, Oklahoma. That every community in the country competes to be able to get the Altus Award. And basically it says, if your community could only be like Altus, Oklahoma, you would have achieved something. It's remarkable to be able to see. In fact, I was in this meeting on Friday, and it was one of the community leaders. We're walking through water issues. I know, shocking that Altus would deal with water issues. We were talking through all these water issues and everything else, and at the end of the meeting, the leader that was there introduced me to somebody that was sitting in and said he's going to be the one that's going to lead this next. It was just a very intentional Moses-Joshua generational focus. So what I would ask you is, as crazy as this is, if you're leading something right now, who's your Joshua that you're mentoring to be able to pass this on to? And have you spent enough time looking at them, telling them you're the Joshua, so that they know, whether it is leading a Sunday school class, that you've got somebody beside you that you're helping mentor in that area, whether it's any role in this church that you're helping equip people, whether it's in your work, whether it's as a mom or a dad that you're mentoring a young mom or dad who are terrified of parenting because children are terrifying, that you're helping them through that process to be able to help answer questions for them. Maybe you're a high school student that you need to mentor a middle school student so they don't mess up the same way you do when you were in middle school, that you're able to walk them through. But to do two things, to take ownership, to say in some areas you're Moses and in some areas you're probably Joshua, still learning and growing. But in the areas where you're Moses, are you intentionally passing down, or are you just hoping somebody else gets it? Can I tell you something? Our neighbors, neighborhood, community, state, nation desperately needs people who walk with God to mentor another younger generation about how to walk with God. But that takes people who have walked with God intentionally choosing to walk with somebody else. I do have people that catch me all the time and say, I'm I'm afraid for the next generation and where we're going. I typically will smile at them and say two things. God has been faithful in our generation. He'll be faithful in the next. And you know what? Moses was the right leader for his generation. But when they walked into the battle, Joshua was the right leader for that one. Totally different. Moses and Joshua are very different. But it was the right person in that battle at that time. I'm convinced that in the next generation, God will continue to be able to raise up families, leaders, people, and that he will be faithful at that moment, as he always has been. There are people that I know that are afraid of being alone because they are alone. They're afraid of their finances because it's fallen apart. They're afraid their children are not walking with God. They're afraid of what's going to happen next in their job. They're afraid because they're currently in some health tests right now, and those health tests could go really, really bad. And some others that are in the process of health tests, and they've already gone bad. And they need to hear the whisper of God saying, I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you. You're afraid because this is a real battle. It's real. It's not a walk in to get ice cream. It's a real battle. But be strong and courageous because I'm going to go with you. I've been faithful and I'll be faithful again. And I've prepared you for this moment. I've been preparing you for years. Now it's time to step in the battle. As simple as I can say, if it was just you and I, not a whole big crowd of people, if it was just you and I sitting to talk, we could have a lot more personal conversation. And you know what I'd ask you? I'd ask you two questions. I would ask you very simply, who's your Shihon and Og? What was the moment that you first watched God be faithful? Think about that and remember God's faithfulness. And then I would ask you what you're afraid of right now. Is it because you're walking in God's will and you're not confident he'll be there? Or it's because you know you're not walking in God's will and you're afraid of what happens outside of his will? Because those two sets of questions will direct a lot of our fears. And will also direct what we do with it after that. I know I'm kind of in your chili somewhat because it's a personal thing for each of us. Because we have different fears. We have different issues that are there. But if we remember God's been faithful, he's going to be there, and he's prepared you for this moment, those fears are different because we know he's there.